And we can already see how IRA drug price controls are already impacting its members' research and development decisions. Specifically, 78% are expected to cancel early-stage pipeline projects, 63% plan to shift research and development away from certain medicines, 95% are expected to develop fewer new uses for medicines because of the limited time available before being subject to government price setting. So, because they can't make as much money, they're not going to spend as much time doing research and development. If we don't do as much research and development, then we don't have breakthroughs in medicine. If we don't have breakthroughs in medicine, then a lot of the gains that we've seen, like for example, tripling life expectancy over the last 100 years, starts to go away. Now, we've seen this time and time again, right? We've seen studies come out that show this, but at the same time, we constantly, for some reason, have more people wanting more and more of it. But I want to run through some of the effects that we've seen throughout history so we can start to understand this. Now, this isn't new for the United States. I talked about it being at the end of, the empire, but we've actually seen it many times in the United States. We saw in 1971 to 1974, then President Richard Nixon used price controls, of course, to control inflation, and then imposed both price controls and wage controls, because of course, if you make more money, that's a problem. That's inflationary. So we saw that, like I said, 1971 to 74, they did that. Now, at first, it did seem to slow the rate of inflation because people didn't have as much money, businesses were not having as much money. But then it ultimately backfired. As a matter of fact, it led to shortages. We saw shortages that happened for goods that were needed, like meat and gasoline and building material. Now, these shortages led to rationing. So in the 70s, they were literally rationing gasoline. You had to go only to the gas station on certain days. It led to black markets for these types of goods to be sold. And eventually they had to cancel it. They had to lift these price controls in 1974 because things had gotten so bad, but the damage was already done. The controls that had led to shortages, rationing black markets, also had discouraged innovation. Of course, no one was investing, no one was building more. Why would I build a factory to bring more supply that could help bring the price down? Why would I do that, invest into that, spend that time, effort, energy, money, risk, if I know that I can't make a profit anyway because they're gonna cap the prices? And so of course they don't. And so then after that was ended, we saw that the period from 1974 to 1984 was a period of very high inflation because then the prices were lifted, so then people could sell them for what they needed to, which means prices went up. So the consumer price index, as measured by CPI, rose an average of 7.8% per year during this period. Now, that was an average of it during that year, so it was obviously much higher. We can see this throughout history. France, 1793, the National Assembly was the ruling body of France during the Revolution. They imposed price controls on a wide range of goods, including at that time apples. This meant apple farmers weren't allowed to sell their apples for more than a certain price. Now, of course, they were unpopular for people wanting to sell apples, and apple farmers were less willing to produce apples if they couldn't get a fair price for them. And if they didn't want to produce more apples, then we didn't have any apples. This is one of the things, the price controls on apples, that we can trace back that actually attributed, or I should say contributed, to the French Revolution. People don't eat, people aren't happy, people don't make money, people aren't happy. When people aren't happy, they tend to go to the streets. We see it in France all the time. As a matter of fact, we see it in France right now. We can go on. We can see that all of this led towards this continued divide between rich and poor. It changed the taxation system. It led to this monarchy class that kind of grew up, that the people weren't happy about, this sort of us versus them, we the people versus the rich. And we see the same thing happening in the United States today. Now, again, we can go back through history some more. We can see China in 1953 to 1980. The Chinese government imposed all types of price controls on a wide range of goods and services that led towards shortages. It was the centrally planned economy, Mao's Great Leap Forward, trying to bring the country forward, that constantly caused these types of things to go. Everyone should work on steel. So then in the backyard of everybody's houses, they had smelting pots and they were making steel, which led to massive amounts of pollution and massive amounts of waste being all over the ground. Then Mao's great idea was, to cut down the forest, or his idea was to go kill all the sparrows because they were eating the crops, and then we got overran by bugs. And constantly was trying to affect one thing that caused much bigger problems. And of course, one of the biggest problems was, yes, a lack of goods, and specifically a lack of food. For example, the price of grain was set at 0.3 yuan per kilogram, which was below cost of production, which then led to a shortage of grain, and then the government had to ration it. Now, we know through Mao's Great Leap Forward, thank you communism, thank you socialism, about 50 million people died during that time. Communism and socialism, it's hard to say exactly, but somewhere have been responsible for about 100 million deaths. 100 million. When you go back through the Bolshevik Revolution in the early 1900s in Russia, through Germany and into Mao's Great Leap Forward, we had about 100 million people died. Many of them, tens of millions of them, directly, murdered as they were opposing the government. But the majority of them died from starvation because of these horrible centrally planned ideas that always tried to control the economy, which always led to price inflation, which always led to price controls, which always led to shortages, which always led to people starving to death. It's sad. It's just the history, though. We saw Venezuela, 2003 to the present. The government's been imposing price controls on all types of goods and services. Venezuela, which was one of the richest countries in the world at the early part of the century, that has massive amounts of natural resources like oil, but yet they just can't seem to get them out of the ground. We see that their current inflation rate is almost 400%, yet they're still trying to impose price controls.